Hi, everybody. My name is Leo Shen, and I'm the convener for the UBC Hong Kong Studies Initiative. Even though we are all spread out in different parts of the world, I want to acknowledge that UBC Vancouver campus is located on the ancestral, unceded, and traditional territory of the Musqueam people. We very much appreciate the chance and the continuing opportunities to be studying, learning, and working in this land. Today, we have two speakers, Professor Cecilia Chu and Dorothy Tang. They'll be speaking on a very interesting collection of photographs on Hong Kong infrastructure. And so this is part of a series of talks that we are holding, or we have held at online this year under the rubric of City Archived. And the idea behind the series is to learn about different kinds of collections that have to do with Hong Kong history, Hong Kong society. And as a historian, of course, I'm very interested in sort of documentary materials, archival materials, but at the same time, of course, there are different kinds of archives, right? Different kinds of collections. And so this is, again, an example of the wonderful sort of diversity, a diverse set of materials that I'm going to learn about today. So very quickly, I want to introduce our speakers. So Professor Cecilia Chu is an associate professor in the Division of Landscape Architecture at the University of Hong Kong. Trained as an urban historian with a background in design and conservation, her research focuses on the social and cultural processes that shape the forms and meanings of built environments and their impact on local communities. Informing her work is an interest in the design and representation of spaces and the production of their social meanings and values. She's the author of the forthcoming book, Colonial Urban Development in Hong Kong, Speculative Housing and Segregation in the City, which will be coming out from Routledge. She's a co-founder and current president of Docomomo Hong Kong, which sounds very interesting. Maybe Cecilia can talk more about that later on. And she's also an editorial board member of the Journal of Urban History and Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society of Hong Kong, very respectable journals, of course. Dorothy Tang is a landscape architect and PhD candidate in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. Her work is concerned with the intersections of infrastructure and everyday life, especially in communities confronting large-scale environmental change. I guess that covers most of our cities. Her current research explores the landscape and urban impacts of Chinese overseas investments in the Mekong region and Southern Africa. Professionally, she has worked on a range of landscape infrastructure projects in China and in Southeast Asia. She was formerly an assistant professor of landscape architecture at the University of Hong Kong, where she also directed the undergraduate program. So without further ado, I would like to ask Cecilia and then Dorothy to speak to us. Welcome and thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Leo, for inviting us to give this webinar for the Hong Kong Studies Initiatives at UBC. Let me just give me a moment. I'm going to be able to turn on the remote control of the screen. Oh, actually, no, I'm not going to do that. Dorothy is going to control it for me. Sorry about this. So as the title of our talk suggests, we will be discussing a collection of construction photographs about Hong Kong's infrastructures, which were showcased in a public exhibition at the City Gallery in Hong Kong in 2018. Today, I will first give a brief introduction to the photo collection, as well as some key issues that we would like to raise in the talk. I will then pass on to Dorothy to discuss some of our curatorial strategies. And after that, in the last segment, we will return to consider some larger questions about the changing values and meanings of these historical photographs as we see them now in 2021, which is 3 years after the exhibition and 40 years after they were first taken. Next slide, please. The photo collection belongs to Heather Coulson, who is a professional photographer who worked in Hong Kong in the 1970s and 80s. Her works focus primarily on large-scale infrastructures, ranging from major roads and highways, the MTR, as well as reservoirs and power plants. All of these works were completed between 1972 to 1988, which was a period that has sometimes been referred to as the golden age of construction in Hong Kong. And all of these photographs were commissioned by major construction companies and corporations in Hong Kong. And almost all of them were taken during the construction phase of the projects, which allowed them to reveal many quite rare behind-the-scene glimpses of the city in the making. And because of this, they made up a very unique set of archival documents about Hong Kong, which distinguished them from other kinds of city images. In 2016, Heather decided to donate about 600 of her photos to the Hong Kong University libraries and make them accessible to the public. Next slide. So this is the City Gallery exhibition, which I and Dorothy co-curated, along with a team of colleagues at HKU. In fact, I think a couple of them are in the audience here. Maybe we can introduce them later in the Q&A. This page also shows the sponsors of the event, including the MTR and the China Light and Power Company, which funded part of the work. It was also supported by the Development Bureau of the HASR government, including the Water Services and the Highways Department, and a number of professional institutes. In fact, to secure funding from our sponsors was not the most easy process at all. And I will talk about this maybe towards the end of the talk to reflect on some of the challenges we faced in the projects and its impacts, and what did we learn about the status of construction industries in Hong Kong. Next slide. Anyway, the exhibition was a great success. We invited Heather and her husband, Coulson, to Hong Kong as our guests of honor for the opening. As you can see, both of them here in the image. Colin was a partner of the consultant engineer for the MTR, the Freeman Fox and Partners, and it was through him that Heather was first introduced to the MTR project, as well as the Cross Harbour Tunnel, which were both featured in our exhibition. Their presence generated quite a bit of media attention, and we also get help from the promotion, from the British Chamber of Commerce, which listed the exhibition as a featured event of the British Design Week. Next slides. Another form of promotion that we got help, which was slightly unexpected, came from the visitors to the exhibition who took many pictures of the displaced photographs and posted them online on Facebook and Instagram. And as you can imagine, we get many interesting comments, not only on the photos, but also about various places in Hong Kong. Next slide. This is especially apparent for those images about the MTR lines and the major roads that connected the different neighborhoods, which became kind of catalysts for people to talk about their memories of specific places and stories about their own experiences of these contexts. Now, not all of these responses were what we expected in the beginning, and they certainly made us become more aware of how powerful these photographs could be in invoking different kinds of interpretations and imaginations that exceeded their role as simply documents about the construction process. Next slide. So this brings to the questions about the nature of construction photography as archive. Like any photographs, all of these photos have two lives, right? The first, in this case, as a set of commissioned works by major corporations in the 1970s and 80s, when they were created by the photographer to showcase the magnificence of these mega projects, conveying a kind of celebrations about Hong Kong's modernizations, when the arrival of new infrastructural systems generated new excitement and aspirations in relation to Hong Kong's economic and social progress that marked that period. And in a few minutes, we will be showing you a video with our interview with Heather, in which she explained in her own words what these photos meant to her and what she imagined meant to the public at the time when they were taken. But then there's the second life of the photos, which exists long after they were taken. Although these images may still be seen today as so-called evidence of historical events, such as in this picture, which was the inauguration of Line Rock Tunnel over 40 years ago. They convey kind of different meanings and association to us and tend to be open to more diverse interpretation and fascination, all dependent on our own knowledge and experience of the photo sites, and even from academic interests. With social historians would probably be very interested in looking at these photos, looking at the construction, some of the labor participating in these projects. And I remember a professor in real estate and constructions would put its focus on those guys looking at construction safety. And to him, this picture became an evidence of how much better that we did today in terms of construction safety. And the picture could be featured in very different sorts of journals and magazines and stories to make a point for these narratives. Next slide. So this was the photo. Sorry about this, a bit small. It's that the photo that got us started. It's a black and white photo of the Cross Harbour Tunnel taken in the 70s. I spotted it one day in the South China Morning Post in 2016, where the article said then that a British photographer named Heather Coulson was to exhibit her works at the HKU libraries. Actually, it turned out to be a complete misunderstanding because there was no exhibition ever planned by anybody. But the librarian told me as I went there to search for the photo that they were processing a set of 600 photos donated by Heather, who specialized in construction photography in Hong Kong in the 70s and 80s. So when Dorothy and I went to see these photos, we were immediately captured by their stunning perspectives. And we thought that, hey, we must do something about it. And we eventually contacted Heather, who was very supportive of our idea of an exhibition. And we subsequently went to the UK to meet her and Colin and started planning for our project. Next. Part of our inspiration came from another exhibition in the UK called the Newcastle City Futures, which utilized historical photographs and planning documents to inspire citizens to take stock of what had happened in the past and stimulate discussions on how to plan for a better or alternative future. So we thought, these photos of Heather were indeed perfect for doing something like that in Hong Kong. But our conceptions of the exhibit, which Dorothy will talk in more details later, were also shaped by our own disciplinary interest. Me as an urban historian focusing on planning and urbanism, and Dorothy as a landscape architect focusing on the role of infrastructure landscapes in sustaining everyday life in the city. So it is a combination of, inspired by the other exhibitions, but also what we really want to convey and to allow the audience to respond to these photos. We believe that these photos could be quite effective in provoking us to imagine what a city was and could have been, and then to stimulate reflections and critiques about the past. And do so, we need to do more research and to pair them with more historical information on these projects and what actually happened to their original conceptions. So these posters were our favorite images with the Mtr Tunnel and the Cross Harbour Tunnel. The one of the on the right of the Cross Harbour Tunnel, the Mtr Tunnel, actually received a prestigious award. Heather received an award, which was also her personal favorite. Next slide. Just a word about Heather Coulson as a photographer in Hong Kong. It is quite unusual, obviously, to be a woman in the 1970s to take up this job, which involved interacting with many construction workers in a male-dominant industry, right? Certainly it took a lot of courage for her to develop a very successful career, which was somewhat unexpected when she first came to Hong Kong. In her own reflections, however, she didn't seem to recall any unpleasant experience with the people she worked with, but she did acknowledge that being a British white woman gave her certain advantage and convenience, and I would assume a level of prestige as well. Not being able to speak Chinese might actually save you some hassles, save her some hassles. And I would imagine it might be more difficult for a Chinese woman to do the same job. Here at the lower left corner was a translated caption from an interview in which Heather was asked why the work of infrastructure has to be done by men, or assume that they have to be done by men. And I think it's a response to a question about that why the construction industries continues to be a gendered industry today, which still reflects a high degree of conservatism. So I will stop here to show you a video of our interview with Heather taken in 2017. And it's about 14 minutes, but we think it's good to show all of it because there are many good images of Heather's work. The video was made by HKU's U-Vision team, and Dorothy will follow up on that after we show the video. Thank you.
I was trained in ophthalmology. I was the daughter of an ophthalmic surgeon. I was very much brought up with optics and anything optical, and maybe that just led me to the field of photography. So how did I develop from doing toys? I think it's a long time ago, but I had a call from an engineer, said, you know, we need some pictures urgently. Could you come and photograph some drawings? Because we've got to get copies, we've got to get them to London, and so I said, yes, sure, I can, and I did that for them. And then he said, actually, we've got another job, an engineering job. Would you be interested? And I said, oh yes, if I can help you, I'd be delighted. I did it for them, I'm very pleased. And it was through that I got other people that had seen what I'd done, or they'd said, oh, this girl did this, I was then, did these documents for us, which was really urgent, and she seemed to be able to handle it. So that was really where it all started. There's a set here of 16 images, and they all show some different aspect of the mass transit railway tunnelling system. There are some crossovers, there are running tunnels, segmented running tunnel, bored tunnel in soft ground. All of these pictures were taken, obviously, when the railway was closed at night. It was only closed between, for my purposes, 2 and 5 in the morning, which was when I had to take these pictures. They were all photographed in colour negative, colour positive, which is transparency, and black and white. I'm not sure why they needed all three, but all three were. So you've really got to concentrate, because if you get your colour temperature wrong, you get your time wrong, you won't get a picture. And I could not afford redoing these jobs. There's another thing about when the tunnels are closed. It always sounds as though there's a train behind you, and it's something to do with the ventilation. And I found that a little bit unnerving the first time I went, because I was on my own. They didn't request that I had a guide or an assistant or an observer with me, so I was entirely on my own, and I found that a little bit unnerving. And but I soon got used to it, but it was a difficult job. I think it's the most difficult job I've ever had to do, because You couldn't automatically bring in flashlights and light the whole scene and then it's easy. Couldn't do that, not allowed. But I enjoyed the challenge of doing that. I was involved with the Cross Harbour Tunnel, which was being constructed at that time. This was a very exciting project because this was the first direct link between the mainland and Hong Kong Island. And up until then, the only way you can cross the harbour with a car is on a ferry. So this, in the fullness of time, was going to really change the whole scene in Hong Kong. And I got involved in that, and that was a very, very interesting time. And it was a real learning curve, but I enjoyed learning. It was just a great time. It was just great for me to have that. And I was very lucky because it rolled on from there to other very much interesting projects as well. But the Cross Harbour Tunnel was a lovely one because it changed the whole face of Hong Kong. And I think that was a real bonus. My favourite project is Castle Peak Power Station. I can say that of all the projects that I was involved with in Hong Kong, this was by far the longest, the biggest and the most exciting that I have ever had in my life. I took a great interest in it because I was given a completely free hand. I could photograph what I liked, when I liked. There was Power Station A, which was partly built when I went to Hong Kong, and the B station was as yet unstarted, and I had that all to myself, which was a great treat. So I was taken on by the Castle Peak B Power Station team to record the progress of the development. They had built the jetty when I arrived. There was a lot of ancillary work going on here for the new B station, and for that I went regularly. It was really the most exciting and varied photographic job anybody could wish for. It was one of my great joys in life, being retained to photograph this as it grew from a small nucleus to a big power station. This is the boiler drum. They want to get a photograph of all the team. And I had a very nice Irishman who was looking after me that day. They had them all ready for a photograph. And they'd made a stand specially for this thing. And I leant over to get something in my case, and my trousers split. And I said, "Oh my God, what am I going to do?" He said, "Don't worry, I'll take you to the uniform department." So I had to hold everything back, and he took me there. And you know how slim Chinese are. And I mean, I'm not overweight myself, but he gave me a white boiler suit. I couldn't do it up. I thought, well, I've got to get on. I've got to do this. They're all waiting to be photographed. That was almost the most, not embarrassing really, because I don't get embarrassed by things like that, but it was slightly inconvenient. But anyway, we got the photograph, and I think they loved their photograph. And the other is when I went up the chimney, and I had site engineer Danny with me, and it's quite a long walk to the top of the chimney in order to get to that angle to photograph the backing slopes. And it took a long time. It was exceedingly hot and very uncomfortable going up the steps. We've got a very heavy bag to carry. And we got to the top, and it was lovely. The weather was perfect, and Danny had a map, a drawing, and he spread it out, held it out, and said, "Hold this." And I held it, and I got a terrible electric shock. And I said, "Danny, this is static. Your hair's standing on end." And he said, "Your hair's standing on end." And I said, "Well, I don't know. I've never experienced anything like this in my life before." But anyway, we didn't touch anything. We didn't go anywhere near each other after that because it was extremely uncomfortable, and I've never experienced it before or since. But I've never forgotten it either. So we did at least get a picture out of it. It's very, very specialist, the construction photography. If you take a picture and there's something wrong with it, they can't use it. Either somebody hasn't got the obvious ones, someone wasn't wearing a hard hat, they're peeing, and that does happen many times, and they think they're not being watched, and there's a lot of things that you have to really be careful about so that they're not infringing the safety regulations, because if they are, you're wasting their money, you're wasting your time, and they can't. So right from the start, I was very, very strict about things like that. And the people that I work with, you know, the people on the shop floor, the people doing the work, they were always very, very helpful, very cooperative, always smiling, and my basic Cantonese was pretty basic then, but we were able to, with, you know, expressions, able to communicate, and that made such a difference to my work. And I never ever had any problems with any workers on site, and I never had any trouble with it. Nobody made a pass at me or queried what I was doing or argued with me or complained or anything like that. And so that really made for considerable enjoyment of my time doing this work. It's the best photography there is. It is really true. There's nothing better. It's just a fun thing. But you've got to use your brains as well, otherwise you get in trouble. But it can be very difficult. The most difficult one really is when you're doing foundations, because there's a lot of mud, there's a lot of mess. You may not necessarily be able to get a high viewpoint, although in Hong Kong you can normally, if you pick your way. I did actually pick my way into Special Branch one day and I got kicked out, but I got the shot that I wanted before they kicked me out. But on the whole, it can be very difficult, because if it's muddy, that probably means there's some plant, pile drivers and things like that, and they blow out at the top black smoke, sometimes black sooty dust. You know, you can get filthy. That's okay, I can dress for that. And I've got a hard hat, I've got a face mask, anything, and earmuffs, everything like that. But there's one other hazard. There's a substance called bentonite, which they put in big holes. And I've never experienced it, but somebody said, don't ever go onto bentonite because we'll never find you. So if I see any large area of a muddy substance, I don't go anywhere near it, because nobody will know if I'm on my own, if I disappear. So there were difficult situations, and it's not very comfortable. It's hot, it's humid, it's not ideal, but it's doable. The photography is doable, but some of the dirty sites are really, really bad. There's another situation that arrives. They get them lunch boxes, and then they all sit down, have lunch. And then there's all these packages everywhere after they've gone. I said, come on, I've got to clear this up. I can't photograph this with all these boxes and things. So okay, they clear it up, but so you have to wait, and sometimes that takes a while, but it doesn't matter because it's just all part of the job. And I think if it was all too easy, it wouldn't be worth doing. Hong Kong was just great in those days. I loved all my time in Hong Kong anyway, but I think those early days were a real treat for me. I think the biggest change is the fact that the transportation and the infrastructure was improving so fast that it made getting around, even, you know, you go to Kowloon to do a job, you've got to get on the ferry. But once you get the Cross Harbour Tunnel open, that made a huge difference, actually getting around. And there were buses out to Stanley, you know, there were better facilities. The other thing that, of course, changed in those years is that we started getting high-rise buildings. And typhoon shelters disappeared. The typhoon shelter at Sai Wan Ho, that became Sai Wan Ho Station. And when I arrived in Hong Kong in 1972, it was full of boats. So that's all to the good. And, you know, I kind of was part of it in a way. And certainly it was changing. It was vibrant. It was a great time to be working in Hong Kong. I know I've said that before, but it really was. It's supposed to be work, but I just enjoyed it so much. met such lovely people. And I did try with my Cantonese, but I didn't get terribly far, but far enough, I think. I could shout across the site and they, wow, what did she say? You know, I could. So that's a bit of my story, really.
So that was a video that the Hong Kong UU Vision team had produced for us. And especially want to thank Lillian Tam, who went on site with us to the UK to interview Heather and really put this all together. I also just wanted to acknowledge the huge team that made the exhibition possible. Before I go into the curatorial strategies, and many of them are in the audience today, including Max de Cotton, who helped with the curation, Olive Wong, I don't know if she's here, and many of the student researchers that were part of the team. So I'm going to share a little bit about the curatorial strategies and how we came to organize the archives and the types of archives that we were interested in. And part of this, really, we need to begin with a story of Hong Kong itself. As most of you know, Hong Kong has really unique topography and geology, and it has been at the heart of how the urban form of the city has shaped where communities lived, and the way that the identity of the city is formed. And so starting in the sort of rapid industrialization of the post-war period, Hong Kong Island was still disconnected from the Kowloon Peninsula, which is where a lot of resources were coming from. And so there were a lot of visions to figure out how to connect the island to the Kowloon Peninsula, as Heather had mentioned. And a lot of the transportation projects, which were spectacular, were really part of the development narrative that shaped Hong Kong. And so in addition to these kind of high profile transportation projects, there were also other types of infrastructure projects that shaped the landscape of Hong Kong, including Hong Kong's utility systems, and how sort of competing economic and political priorities sort of quietly shaped the landscape of the territory. This includes the freshwater systems, where the watershed boundaries that protect the large reservoirs in Hong Kong actually coincide with the boundaries of country parks, as well as electricity networks that power the city today. So we were interested in how Heather's narratives and her documentation of Hong Kong as a city could be visualized and told through her photography, so that we could understand Hong Kong not as a sort of static space, the space that we know and love today, but how it became into being and how this becoming would also help us think about the current and contemporary city today. So one of the major curatorial challenges was working with a huge collection of photographs with a large range of infrastructure projects and major architecture projects in Hong Kong. And so as Cecilia had mentioned before, there were Heather had literally come to Hong Kong and donated about 600 photographs from her private collection. Many of them were taken in medium format transparencies, and so they're extremely high resolution. And because they were in transparency form, so we actually had to wait for the Hong Kong U libraries to digitize most of them in low resolution before we could go and sort through the huge archive that she had donated. In addition to that, when we went to visit Heather in her UK home, she had tons of prints as well as additional transparencies that she had not donated to the Hong Kong U Library that was also extremely rich. And so what we decided to do based on our conversations with Heather, as well as looking at what was available available in the photography collection was that we decided to organize the exhibition along two major categories. As I mentioned before, Hong Kong is shaped by highly visible urban mobility networks, including highways and railways. And the second is the hidden utility systems like waterworks and electricity supply. Based on these categories, we then chose major projects, such as the initial MTR lines, the Cross Harbour Tunnel in 1972, that constitute Route 1 highway systems connecting Aberdeen to Sha Tin. And then we looked at water systems such as the Harbour Island pumping station at Plover Cove Reservoir, and lastly, the Castle Peak Power Station B, which Heather had mentioned. And just to give you a bit of context, Castle Peak is actually quite important because the chimney that she mentioned when it was completed was the largest concrete structure in Hong Kong, even in relationship to a lot of the skyscrapers that she mentioned. So as I mentioned, we organized around these themes. We organized the entire exhibition around 24 photographs that we selected from the photography collection. But in addition to these photographs, we felt that it was really important to contextualize where these photographs came from and the spaces around it. So like all mega projects, each selected infrastructure emerged through intense negotiations over the need to provide either essential services to the city residents, how to manage limited resources of the territory, and to facilitate economic growth and urban development. And these considerations in turn became the foundation for deriving innovative engineering solutions and early experiments in infrastructure financing. So to enable the audience to understand evolving design decisions and media discourses behind each scheme, we supplement the photographs with original planning documents, newspaper articles, interviews, as well as interpretive drawings that map the spatial imprints of each of these projects in Hong Kong. So as you can see from this image, we organized the themes based on what the urban demands of that time were. We looked at what other options and alternatives were explored in addition to the final product. We looked at how each of these infrastructures were actually part of large-scale urban systems. And then lastly, we produced maps and drawings that highlighted how these infrastructure projects intersected with contemporary everyday life. In addition to that, we were able to uncover a series of construction documents that complement the photographs. So you can literally see how the structures were designed and the engineering that goes on behind it. So I'm just going to show you some drawings and documents that we were able to uncover from a variety of archives throughout Hong Kong, including the Hong Kong U Library Special Collections. We went to the Water Services Department and actually looked through their original documents. We also had support from CLP. So here what you see on the left is our early studies. It says 1986, but it is a projection from the 60s looking at how traffic would change if there were better connections between the Kowloon Peninsula and Hong Kong. And as a part of these planning exercises, there were a number of different visions and architectural designs actually for the Cross Harbour tunnels that were the first one that was completed in 1972. And so you see these architectural renderings on the right. Very, very different, I think, from what we recall today. We also began to look into technical journals, such as the Journal of the Engineering Society of Hong Kong, and some of the cover art of these journals were fascinating and depicted their visions of what the future of the city could be from these kind of, these sort of flying streetcars, almost like mimicking a sci-fi movie from the 1970s, to the right where you see a little bit more realistic, actually renderings of the MTR stations that were actually under construction at that time and planned. We also, like I mentioned, looked into construction documentation to understand the technologies that created the MTR system and the systems that were associated with it. But it was also very, very important for us to understand what other voices were were talking about these infrastructure projects. And so we did an archival research. We looked at newspaper articles and tried to curate some of these articles that offered another view of how these infrastructures came to life. And so, for example, here, there was a debate over how you could encourage people to take the MTR system. And because it was such an expensive system, what were the strategies to force the public to use public transport and to make it worthwhile? On the right, you see controversies over some of the largest reservoir systems built in Hong Kong. They were reclaimed from the sea actually. And so there were controversies over how the British government was actually supplying salt water to the public. And that was a huge political problem. But in addition to these alternative voices of the time, we also thought it was really important to visualize. And here, I just want to credit Olive Wong for her excellent work on these drawings. We began to map these systems in their urban context. And so on the right, on the left, you see the MTR systems. You see how various types of urbanity, retail, commercial buildings, and so on and so forth are built upon this network of transportation infrastructure, something that is pioneered in Hong Kong and now is replicated throughout the world. And then on the right, you see, this is Plover Cove Reservoir, how this particular piece of infrastructure actually expanded its watershed through a number of different smaller pieces of infrastructure, but has also become a really critical recreation site for boating, for fishing, and for hiking on the weekends. And it's a very important aspect of urban life in Hong Kong. And so these were also important to portray to the general audience. We then, I'm just going to go through some of the photographs because I'm sure this is what you're most interested in, but we can talk about some of the themes in our lessons a little bit later. So here are two different MTR stations that were photographed by Heather in the 70s and 80s. The first one is Admiralty Station under construction. You probably can't recognize it because that part of Hong Kong is completely transformed. And this was one of the only, instead of boring into the ground, this was an excavation and then cover operation, and was one of the only stations that was constructed in this way, which also accounts for how large and extensive the network is. On the right, you see how the MTR had to negotiate Hong Kong's topography and urbanity in a different way. And here you see the above ground sections of the MTR in Kowloon. You also see here how the drinking water, freshwater reservoirs evolved over time. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but during the time that Heather was active in Hong Kong, there was a lot of technological changes and shifts from collecting water locally to importing water from China. And on the right, when you see the Tai Mei Tuk pumping station, which was built to receive water from China in Plover Cove Reservoir and pump it to High Island Reservoir. And so enlarging and reinforcing an existing network. Here, again, very familiar. On the left is the approach roads to the Cross Harbour Tunnel in Causeway Bay. It was Heather's first project. You see the typhoon shelter in Causeway Bay in the background, and you can sort of see the Hong Kong Yacht Club in the background as well. And again, this particular landscape has completely transformed and changed since this photograph was taken. Another familiar yet unfamiliar site is the Sha Tin Bridge in the New Territories under construction, and it has become one of the major arteries for transportation in the New Territories connecting to Hong Kong Island. Last but not least, we featured the Castle Peak B power station, which at the time it was built was the largest power station in Asia. And it was really unique because it was planned around the energy crisis. And so it was designed to have it was designed to be a dual kind of fuel a power station. So it has coal as well as oil as its energy source. And so they had to plan for different ways of bringing in the fuel. I'm going to end on this photograph of the opening of the exhibition and just sort of reflect on the immense kind of interactions that we actually had through this entire project with the Hong Kong public, and Heather's ability to really speak to Hong Kong and its infrastructure in such a unique way. And I'm going to pass it over to Cecilia to reflect a bit more on how the exhibition played out.
Great, thanks, Dorothy. I'm a little conscious about the time. It's already 10:50. I'll make it short just to reflect on a few points. In a way, it is quite nice to look back today, in 2021 at the exhibition, because there's a certain distance being created between the 3 years, which allows us to reflect on it more critically, something that we were not able to do during the event itself. Dorothy, can you change the next slides? So the first thing that we learned, and to me, this is quite interesting personally, is about getting funding for this exhibition. As the slide shows here, that we have a lot of supporting organizations, but it was actually quite a bit of struggle in the beginning to get anyone to pay attention to my proposal, our proposal. But at one time for 2 weeks, I took the Heather's photos in the portfolios to go around to CLP, to MTR, to try to talk to these people and to get them to support us. But nobody seems to be interested in a bunch of academics doing a photo exhibition of infrastructure. Even I send them samples and try to persuade them, but to no avail. And I also went to my colleagues at the Faculty of Architecture at HKU, talking to architects, landscape architects, plannings, and urban designers. Everyone said, oh, it's amazing photos, we support you, but we cannot give you any money. So finally, I went to the Department of Real Estate and Construction at HKU. I met Professor Steve Rowlandson, who turned out to be one of the most connected person to Hong Kong's major developers and construction companies. And he invited me, I remember very clearly, to his house for an annual party in which he invited a lot of the major representatives of major companies there. And I went around and showed them. And boom, these people in the party, they loved it. And they also asked me if they could one day buy one of these photos they hang up on their walls. And they were very enthusiastic and said, okay, it's fine. I will call up these developers tomorrow and I'll ask them to contact you. And that's how I finally get the attention from the NTR and also CLP, eventually, who gave us the money to do this exhibition. So I think that the situation is quite interesting and telling about the kind of power relations that work in Hong Kong's business industries. And there's certainly a lot of pride and sense of ownership among these representatives of these companies that we talk to. And but once the door is open, then everybody becomes very interested and support our project. Next slide. The other reflection is about a bit of an unexpected media attention generated by the exhibition, and that these photos became a great source for remembering the 1970s and 80s. Remember, we said earlier, and also shown in Dorothy's her part of the presentations, that we had kind of, as academics, we had certain goals. We wanted to stimulate the public to reflect on the past and think about the planning of the futures. But as you see in the headline of most of the media that reported on the events, they were quite nostalgic. The focus mostly is on remembering the 1970s and 80s as the golden age of construction, that it represents a success story of Hong Kong, something that's almost with a kind of utopian undertone, describing that period of history. Next slides. There are many reports like this. So in this article, again, it said it's the golden age of the 70s, and even Heather and Colin themselves became a symbol representing that era. That obviously, being British, old British couple, they became also embodied the kind of optimisms and maybe a bit of a bitter, some bitterness now, people thinking that things are not as good as in the past, in the 40 years. There became a kind of collective memories of Hong Kong. Next slides. But nostalgia aside, another reflection is from the enthusiasms with the community workshop that we organized during the exhibition at the City Gallery. We invited about 100 participants from different universities and community organizations to come and discuss about the future of Hong Kong's infrastructures based on the 4 types of works that we showcased: railways, highways, water, and electricities. And specifically, next slides, the participants were asked to consider the present provision of these services, how they have shaped everyday life of communities, and ultimately came up with ideas of what would make the city work better in a near and long-term future. So these are some of these narratives that are very interesting. Many interesting debates between the members of the different groups, which include students, professionals, NGO members, and many others to join. And we were inspired with the results, with many constructive critiques on various aspects of planning, on development, and on governance, and also some creative solutions being proposed. Next slide. Just to return to the question of construction photography as archival documents of Hong Kong. Obviously, the meanings of and relations to these images have changed in their second lives, right? Today, they no longer carry the same set of utopian sentiments that underlay the 70s and 80s, and to different people, they came to associate with their own individual and collective experience with the places in the past 4 decades. The 2 right images here are comments given by the visitors to the exhibitions. Extremely interesting to see the very different responses and emotions invoked by the project. Next slides. I will end this talk with a slightly controversial image. This is a photo of the Mtr Entrance at HKU. I think it's Dorothy's photograph, or you took that one in the summer of 2019, when the university was besieged by the protest. And later on, in fact, the MTR lifts and railings were also destroyed. What's interesting here, of course, is the clear indication of the changed relationship with the MTR as a public utility and also a quasi-privatized corporations later. And a thought, in fact, came up to us looking back, that if our exhibition was held in 2019 and not 2018, we may get different responses to it, and maybe we will need to shore up the security. We don't know. We actually plan to have a roving exhibition next year because these materials were still stored in my office, and we are still hoping to relaunch a second part of the exhibition at another venue in 2022. And Heather and Colin would like to come back to Hong Kong and see the second part of the exhibition. And so once again, these events points to the importance of infrastructure in shaping our everyday life, our ongoing experience, and also the constructions of both individual and collective memories in the future. And I will end here. I'm sure maybe the audience would have some questions about the photographs and any aspects about the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia and Dorothy. That's wonderful. Many questions in my head, but I will encourage our audience to you have 2 options. You may either post your questions or comments on the chat area, or if you would like, you may also raise your hand and then come on audio or video. So it's your choice, right? So we have about 20 some minutes, so we have time. So let me first take the first question from Professor Oakes, I think. So the nostalgia for golden age of construction, something that Cecilia and Dorothy talked about, right, seems to speak to a Hong Kong identity built around infrastructure. Can you, or both of you, comment more on the relationship between infrastructure and Hong Kong identity, and whether that identity from the golden age continues today? That's a wonderful question. So, tough one. It's like a PhD exam. So go ahead.
Ironically, Tim is actually on my committee. So
I would say that Tim is the PhD examiner of Dorothy.
Oh, oops.
Maybe Dorothy have more to say, but I just want to make one comment, an observation. So this excitement about infrastructure is something that I think is still continues, because as we remember, in a discussion I had with Dorothy before the presentation, we remember, I think it was in 2015, that the MTR extended line, right? Because MTR stopped at Sheung but then Sai Ying Pun, HKU, and Kennedy Town, these three new stations were built and completed in 2015. And we remember quite clearly at the time, there was great excitement of the public to come and see this amazing infrastructure. So there is still a kind of continuation of this optimism about infrastructure, what they did, and allow people to project and think of, associated with the kind of still a modernization process that allows it to, it benefits everyday life and allows people to think of a better life in the future. But it is also a bit, there is conflicting association with these infrastructure, specific kinds of infrastructure, like the MTR in the 2019 protest. It became kind of complicated by these notions of it's associated with the government. But in general, I think from our experience with the exhibition, the kind of enthusiasms and optimism still, I think they still exist. And it has to do with the historical experience of Hong Kong, that there was this sort of tremendous progress associated with the golden age of construction.
So growing up, when I went to Hong Kong in the 80s, I remember being dragged from my uncle's house in Causeway Bay and going to visit my grandparents in Sheung, and taking the MTR and jet lagged, falling asleep, and taking this sort of new infrastructure across the territory in a very easy way. Whereas my parents, who grew up in Hong Kong, went to Chinese U, had this like memories of, the train running, I don't know, once every hour, and taking the ferry. My uncle talked about, driving to Kowloon and taking the ferry. And if he got stuck on the other side, he had to stay overnight. So there's definitely a memory of this kind of huge inconvenience. But I think that the nostalgia is much more associated with specific types of infrastructure. Right, so transportation infrastructure, because it is such a visible part of everyday life, and it has the connectivity between Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, was so important that whenever that moment, whenever different moments of a cross harbor tunnel was built and so on and so forth, there seemed to be extreme excitement over the ability to go somewhere faster. And to be more convenient. Whereas a lot of utilities and the innovation in, for example, water provision or electricity were kind of hidden away. And so while Castle Peak was when it was built, was a really innovative project. It was the largest power station in Asia at that time. But that was kind of overlooked by the more visible types of infrastructure. And so a lot of the nostalgia, I would actually argue, are directed towards a very particular kind of infrastructure and a particular period when that connectivity was enhanced. And so I don't have the chart at the moment, but I've actually created a timeline of all of the major infrastructure projects in Hong Kong. And what you begin to see are patterns where electricity utilities were really built prior to the 1960s and 70s. And in the 1970s and 80s, you begin to see more spectacular infrastructures getting built, which is why I think Heather's photographs really capture that particular moment. And so mobility becomes the real heart of that nostalgia. I think it continues. As Cecilia mentioned, there were tourists on the Hong Kong U campus when the Mtr station was first completed. When the Tung Chung line connecting Central to the airport was built, that also opened with huge fanfare. It was in fact in the 20th century, it was one of the top 10 engineering projects in the world, comparable to projects like the Panama Canal. So that level of investment of engineering was a really critical part of how Hong Kongers understood their territories and how they related to the different forms of urbanization that were happening at that time.
I would like to maybe, sorry, just want to add one comment. As Dorothy said, we have 4 types of infrastructures that we exhibit. Obviously, the highways and the MTR are the more obvious that people relate and take them as symbols of the golden age of constructions. But for water and electricity, something quite interesting came up in the workshop that our participants, when they were presenting, and someone related these kind of provisions to a kind of pride about how efficient Hong Kong was, rather than seeing the infrastructure that normally we don't really think about it. But then when they were asked about these questions about how we related to these provisions, right? Then I think it prompted a kind of reflections. Then someone was saying that, oh, electricity was actually very stable. The supply was very stable when they went to, I think someone said when they went to the States, and they experienced this sort of prolonged electricity kind of outage. And so again, that enabled them to identify Hong Kong as a better place. I mean, that is controversial, of course. This is the narrative of this person. But I think that relates to the questions about identity. How does infrastructure enable a certain different aspects of Hong Kong identity, not only in the physical forms, but in how they take as what Hong Kong is about this sort of efficiency and being modern and advanced, and with all the progress made in the past.
Thank you. Professor Oakes, would you like to follow up, or would you like to do another test?
No, you passed. That was far more layered responses than I could have hoped for. So thank you so much. It's I missed the exhibition in Hong Kong, so I was really excited to see this, and thank you again.
So I'm interested in timelines. It's very boring in some way, but I find timelines actually quite useful. So Dorothy, how far back do you trace? I mean, of course, the infrastructure could, it could be endless, really, in some way. But anyway, how far back do you trace? And
well, for this particular project, I traced back to, well, we kind of started 1842, but we were also trying to map out how, at what point Hong Kong's technology, how it related to the rest of the world. So we actually looked at critical things like when the first subway was built, when sort of the first kinds of large-scale reservoirs were built, and mapped that in relationship to when Hong Kong started building those. And so while Hong Kong's timeline, unfortunately in a very colonial way, started in 1842, but in relationship to the rest of the world, we've tried to contextualize when these different projects were built. And one of the conclusions that I came to through this observation was that it really reflects a different mode of governance. And so the transportation infrastructure was not as heavily invested in until after the 1970s. And as for those of you that are familiar with Hong Kong history, that was a critical watershed moment, literally, in terms of how the British government related to local Chinese population. And so you begin to see that the kinds of infrastructures that were provided by the colonial government shift and change. And then in 98, when the airport core project was built, that was also signaling and symbolizing a different era of sort of political shifts and changes as well. And so I think that continues. I mean, we didn't talk about it in this particular session, but other projects such as the third runway for Hong Kong Airport, the Macau-Zhuhai Hong Kong Bridge, and the sort of vision of a sort of larger Greater Bay Area also rely on how politics relate to infrastructure projects.
Yeah, this is sorry, Cecilia, go ahead.
No, just a supplementary comments. Well, part of the selection, of course, is governed by what we could do, and also the availability of the more and more materials after the 60s. But it's interesting because the exhibition was actually was exhibited at the City Gallery of Hong Kong, right? The City Gallery, as some of you may know, is a government institution that they actually have a parallel exhibits about water at the time when we were exhibiting this there's a permanent exhibition. So it might be interesting to compare our timeline with their timeline, with the City Gallery's timeline, which parallel each other. But even within the same timeline, they also focus more on the later part of the 20th century. But our strategy is to, as Dorothy said, and has shown you earlier, that we focus on the kind of different options and debates and challenges and maybe conflicts that's behind these decisions. So and again, the idea that the city could have been moved towards different directions depending on the options we chose. But the timeline indicated by the City Gallery and by the government narrative is linear. It is basically milestones after milestones without kind of challenges and conflicts. So that's something that we wanted to do. Doesn't matter shorter the timeline or longer the timeline. They are all shaped by these sort of more multiple options and ideas.
Now that's such a rich topic, right? Because in some way the construction, right, the infrastructure is an indicator of a kind of a commitment on the part of the government, right, in terms of how much investment to put in. Of course, at first they needed to build reservoir. I mean, that's important in order for simply survival. But then once you get into the more, perhaps maybe not, well, slightly more optional ones, then in some way it is sort of a reflection of the commitment on the government in terms of, whether Hong Kong is something to keep or something to expand on. Anyway, it's all very interesting. So I want to go back to the chat. I'm going to, if I may, I'm going to skip Michelle's question about photography for now, but because I think Justin's question, John's question, I think they go together in some way, which has to do with, so this is an exhibition. There's obviously you were expecting an audience. So I think Justin's question is about what were your expectation or aspiration? What did you want the audience to experience? So what is there a narrative that you want them to arrive at, or is it a completely open-ended exhibition? So what were the objectives? I think that's, if I can paraphrase Justin's question.
I think that Dorothy can supplement, but I think our original intention, right, coming from our own backgrounds, also we work in the division of landscape architecture. We thought that there's a values in these photographs to illustrate the kind of unseen connections between infrastructures and everyday life, which is very important, shaping governance, shaping resources. And this is not something that citizens are aware, or a lot of normally from day-to-day life, we don't think about these things. So to kind of raise that kind of awareness, it's something that we wanted to do, but also to in the community workshop that I showed earlier, is to use these photographs to stimulate debates about the future and really linking learning from the past, such as the Newcastle City Futures exhibit that I mentioned as a reference, that it was very successful, creating a so-called urban room within the exhibition for people to come and discuss. And it didn't really lead to very concrete solutions or policies proposals, but it's more of raising a public awareness, but also constructive dialogues that we very much needed in thinking about resources, such as water, for example. In a community workshop, there were different options floated, but kind of also reflecting about, moving from a more, it's not really self-sufficient, and Dorothy has more to say about this, but relying on supply from the mainland. And there is a kind of implications on the everyday and kind of relationships with our resources. So that's the kind of stimulation we want. I think we, in some way, we achieved that. The nostalgic reaction was a little bit more unexpected. Right?
Dorothy, do you have any?
The only thing that I would add to that is that by what we were hoping to actually avoid the nostalgia by bringing in the kind of debates at the time to illustrate how a lot of these projects were not, smooth sailing. There were a lot of difficulties. There were a lot of controversies at that time. And so rather than thinking of the past as like the good old days, is to also acknowledge that a lot of the issues that happened during that time are still relevant and are still happening in contemporary society. So maybe that didn't come out as much in the exhibition itself, but that was definitely one of the intentions.
Thank you. John, are you there? Are you still around? Can you come on audio? I'm going to call on you to come on audio if you're there. Otherwise, I'll read your questions for you.
Well, you can read my question too. That's fine by me. I guess the gist of the question. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. The gist of my question is that the way we looked at infrastructure just now seemed quite positive. I guess it's back to what Dorothy just mentioned. But if we were to think about it from today's standpoint, and at least the rhetoric in Hong Kong right now, infrastructure does not necessarily need to be positive. Infrastructure development also entails a lot of negative aspects, which the pictures we've seen don't seem to totally capture. There seems to be a parallel discourse of things like the destruction of the old General Post Office building, just to make room for the MTR. But that is almost as if it's compartmentalized. There are two different paths that we're talking about. I just wonder if in your interactions with the audience, whether you get different nostalgic feelings about destruction or construction that varied by age group, or whether there's something that you'll entertain as you further develop this exhibition.
That's a really interesting question. Thanks, John. We actually have done a survey of the age group, and not survey of the age group, but in our survey, people have to put down their age and along with their comments. And I think it's divided. I think that if you really look at the comments, there are quite a lot of critical comments about the current problems of the current modes of planning in Hong Kong. So the 70s and 80s, partly those kind of optimistic and positive feeling about the era. It's partly the images themselves, because they were taken at that time. They convey a kind of almost utopian undertone of those. But I think that the audience or some of them are quite critical, as also shown in a community workshop. They almost using those images to critique as a ways to critique some of the challenges that we're facing in the present. So that's slightly different from what the media, headlines of the media suggest. And yeah.
Okay, Dorothy, do you have anything to add?
No, unfortunately, I was not able to participate in a lot of the community workshops, but I do think that, like what Cecilia said, the relationship to infrastructure in the past decade in Hong Kong has really changed. As governance has shifted, as politics have grown more divided, I think that, I mean, not quite sure what more to add, but I do think that it's probably not by age group. I think it also relates to perception of power. My parents were very negative about the colonial government. And so they, when I asked them about, for example, the reservoirs, they were kind of like, oh yeah, that was just a stupid British project. You know, they were very dismissive of a lot of that work, and they politically were anti-British colonial government. So I think it's not just a certain age group. I think it also reflects certain affinities with the government.
I think that there's certainly a thinking about your way of putting it, John, about the parallel discourse. I think there certainly is. And what's interesting is, now I come to think about it, a lot of some of the young people, you know, they are critical about the current situation. But looking back and looking at these photos, because some of the young people in the 20s, they actually didn't live through the 70s and 80s. So that's projected a kind of imagination, right? Imaginaries about the 70s and 80s, the golden age, and what they were. And that could be in some way problematic, because that was the kind of very strong discourse in Hong Kong, right? In associating with what happened 40 years ago is all the good things, right? And partly this was supported by the government narrative. So what we wanted to do is to, in a way, also unsettle that discourse, right? By bringing in the conflicts and the challenges. That was parallel, that's something that paralleled now, right? What happened before, there were all sorts of challenges similar to today, maybe even more challenges, given all the complications with the economy, with decisions that we have to make with resources. So, so yeah, I mean, that's parallel discourse.
Well, that's great. I think it's a nice reminder that Hong Kong was not necessarily a laissez-faire regime, and that a strong regime was not necessarily bad, a weak regime not necessarily good.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, John. Eventually I would like to circle back to Sabrina's question, but Renren has his hands up. So Renren, would you like to come on audio or video to ask your question? Oh, thank you. Renren.
Yes, thanks, Leo. Also, thank to presenters for this very thoughtful presentation. So I'm also thinking about the issue of nostalgia, and I think it might has to do with I noticed that this group of construction photography are very depersonalized in a way that you hardly see any, for instance, any close-ups of the construction workers. They're always represented in groups. And it's also very hard to tell. This is a set of pictures done by a British white woman, right? The kind of racial, gender, and cultural identity is not that very visible in terms of the composition of the images. So I was wondering about her gaze at the construction side, and Heather also talked about in the documentary her fright, her nervous feeling, right, when she entered that transit railway tunnel system. But that kind of feeling is absent from those pictures, which is about the industrial splendor, spectacle, or the utopic yearning, right, towards a more modernized future. So I was wondering, this is maybe it has to do with the genre of construction photography and how we are supposed to look at this genre and explore and what kind of information we can get from it, right? Because it features the built environment as protagonist. It's very different from the kind of photography we are used to appreciating it's not that artsy in a more personal way, I would say. And so that also makes me think about what is everyday there in this set of photographs. we do not see any of the commoners or local residents, let alone, right, as John mentioned, the site of demolition. So yeah, that's a question that common, but yeah, here it is there.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. We're not going to really answer it, but you're absolutely right, Ren. I think you know more actually how to deconstruct these photographs. Obviously, in photography theory, there's a lot of discussions about the institutionalizations of photographs because they were products of certain power relationships shaping these photos and the depersonalizations. I think these photos can act as a source for further critiques in visual culture alongside with other kinds of photographs of the same site. So in that sense, I think that's the values of them as an archive, not just as photographs documenting the path of evidence of these great projects, but to compare them with more personalized images of the same sites and angles showing the kind of people and objects that was being screened out from these photos. So so that's what makes them also interesting as archives. But we need to be more critical about them, as you suggest.
I think in addition to the problem of the archive, there's also a problem of curation, which fully falls on our shoulders, of course. But the question of curation, because this collection was Heather's self-curation. She donated, she picked these 600 photos to donate. She picked the specific kinds of projects that she felt were worth donating and worth becoming sort of a part of the sort of public discourse. And so part of it, there is a question of how she did that. We were never able to get to the heart of how she picked them, because she definitely did choose some and not all of her photographs to donate. And the second question related to this particular genre is that we did actually look at a lot of construction photographs from the Water Services Department in their archives. And there was a distinction between, I think and Heather mentions this, but she didn't donate that part of her collection, which was she was hired to document the most mundane and boring things. Right. And so what you see here is a sort of self-conscious decision to show certain kinds of images and certain kinds of relationships. And she didn't show, the electric room of the Harbour, across Harbour Tunnel. She didn't show the various components. But in her interview, she also mentioned that because these photos aren't just, these photos are actually staged to a certain extent, right? People had to have their hard hats. They had to clear away all the trash. These were supposed to go on the calendars of certain construction companies into their portfolios and so on and so forth. And so they were curated in that way as well. And so I think a lot of what you were talking about are definitely reflected in the way that the subjects are shown.
Thanks,
So
very helpful.
Yeah, so very interesting. I'm mindful of time, but I do want to bring up Sabrina's question, which I think is quite important. And since we're doing a PhD exam at the very beginning, I think this is the kind of question you may expect next time when you do an exhibition. So I think this, you may want to give it a dry run. So I want to come back to that question at the end. That's our last question. I know that there are other questions in the chat area. We won't be able to get to them today, but I hope that at the end of the session at 8:30-ish, maybe Dorothy and Cecilia can stay around for another 5-10 minutes, and we'll just emulate sort of the mingling around if we were in person. People can come up and talk to our speakers, so we just do that kind of thing. So the last question, so while development in the golden age of Hong Kong resonates with success, utopia, and collective memory, how has public value towards development changed over the years? I guess the question is about, we seem to have changed our, well, the word development has changed in some way from a sort of positive connotation to perhaps a more negative connotation, right? I mean, it's a very general comment on this, but would you like to comment on this, the idea of because infrastructure is often tied with development, modernization, which is tied to good, something good, positive. But that may, again, I'm thinking about, for example, the express rail, right? That's clearly has different kinds of discourses associated with it. So anyway, please comment.
That's a large question, and I don't want to generalize too much, but I think that as most of you in the audience have some knowledge about Hong Kong, and also are scholars about Hong Kong, we kind of know that in the 60s and 70s, Hong Kong was still developing, and there was a big public housing programs, and the idea of public good is different. And a lot of people were, associating with the golden age of construction is also a sense of upward mobility, that people could move up. We are moving towards a better future, right? So that relationship somewhat has changed, not really through just 1997 and not through just one project like the Express Rail, but it has to do with this sort of very slow, gradual changes in the 80s and 90s, when a lot of companies become more privatized, and there's sort of a neoliberal turn in which ordinary people, it's harder for ordinary people to bridge the gap, own a home, and more social discrepancies has widened. So these kind of relationships cannot be divorced from the larger considerations of the trust with infrastructures and government and idea of development, because development used to be associated with these optimisms and the good, right? But so that, I think that transition is very complex, and obviously other social historians have done better jobs in explaining that. And I think what we're presenting here and infrastructure is related to this larger patterns of social change. It's important for us to look closer into what happens in the different segments in the economies, what happened to different groups, different communities, affecting their daily life.
Thank you. And final words, Dorothy?
That was a very difficult question, I think, because what development means and how that manifests and what is associated with in the public imagination is complex, especially in a place like Hong Kong, where development is associated with a particular social economic class and power structures. So I don't have that much more to add than what Cecilia had just said, but I do think that it's been interesting to see how infrastructure has reemerged at the forefront of a lot of these debates today.
I have one more thought, actually. I think these discussions point to the importance of space and materiality, because when we talk about identity and development, sometimes it floats on just concepts, right? And I remember, I want to kind of point to discussions that I heard. I think John Wong, last night, there was a Hong Kong Studies forum on Hong Kong homes, right? I think John raised the questions about space, the importance of everyday space and materiality, and how that really is play a really important role in shaping our identities. And sometimes when we talk about literature and kind of in some discussions in more abstract terms about identities and politics, we forgot that our landscapes, our infrastructure, spatial entities are very important in tying with our everyday experiences. So that, of course, the social discrepancies, the income disparities is part of that, but they completely tied with how we live, right? How we live, what kind of home do we stay in, and what kind of public transportation we take every day. So I think that's part of also the goal of the exhibition, is to remind us of these very important connections between infrastructures and identity and everyday life and politics.
This is wonderful. And is there really a plan to have another exhibition next year? Is that the plan?
Yes, I mean there are two plans actually. One is to exhibit it again. We're still looking for venues. All the materials are there, so I probably would be maybe early next year in spring. And we're also preparing for a book proposal, showcasing Heather's pictures, and looking for essays to have some meaningful reflections on these histories and suggesting what do these things mean and help us to think about the future. And I don't know if actually one of the editor interested in our projects is here in the audience, but we talked to some people, and so hopefully we'll work on this project soon.
Especially this, I mean, from what Dorothy mentioned, right? There are all these drawings that went along with the, I mean, those should be made more widely available. I would like to send those seem wonderful materials. I'm mindful of time, and in fact we went over because I'm not a very good moderator. I sort of let it run. But let me just say some final words on. So I want to thank the various units at UBC who have been supportive of the Hong Kong Studies Initiative. So my home departments, the Department of History, the Department of Asian Studies, the Center for Chinese Research, the UBC Asian Library, and the Interdisciplinary History Research Cluster. All of these units on campus, even though we haven't been on campus for a long time, but they have been very supportive of what we do and for this series. So I want to thank them. I want to thank my student helpers, Michelle and Justin, for helping us. And again, please join me. I want to thank the audience for participating, for raising good questions. And so audience, please join me in thanking Dorothy and Cecilia for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.